He thought the storm would pass in a day or two, but when the snow finally stopped, his cabin was buried 30 feet deep, the door sealed shut, and 6 months of winter stretched ahead with no way out and no one coming. What he found in the frozen darkness beneath his feet would either save his life or destroy everything he thought he knew about survival, trust, and the thin line between fortune and curse. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The wind had started as a whisper on the morning of October 14th, 2023. Marcus Hale stood on the porch of his cabin, coffee steaming in his weathered hands, watching the aspens tremble in the pre-dawn light. He was 42 years old, though the mountains had carved lines into his face that made him look older. His beard, once dark brown, now carried threads of silver. His hands were scarred from years of work, from building fires and splitting wood, from survival that had become ritual. The cabin sat at 11,000 feet in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, a 3-hour hike from the nearest road, accessible only by a trail that switchbacked through pine forests and across rocky ridges where bighorn sheep watched with ancient eyes. Marcus had chosen this place deliberately 5 years ago, remote enough that the world couldn't reach him, isolated enough that he could finally hear himself think. Or maybe stop thinking altogether. He'd been a park ranger once. 20 years with the National Park Service, working in Yellowstone, then Rocky Mountain National Park, then finally here in the San Juans. He knew wilderness the way some men knew city streets, could read weather in the behavior of birds, could find water in the driest terrain, could survive on almost nothing when he had to. But knowledge and survival were different things. One was technical, the other was spiritual. And after Emily died, Marcus had lost his grip on both. The cancer took her in 8 months, pancreatic. By the time they caught it, there was nothing to catch. Just a countdown. She was 39. They'd been married for 16 years. No children, just each other and the mountains, and a life they'd built around campfires and trail maps, and the kind of love that doesn't need words to be understood. When she passed, Marcus kept working for another year. Showed up to ranger stations, led search and rescue operations, smiled when people asked how he was doing. But inside, he was hollowed out. Every sunset reminded him of her. Every trail they'd hiked together became a wound he couldn't stop touching. So one day he turned in his badge, bought this old mining claim cabin from a retired prospector, and walked into the wilderness with the intention of never really coming back. That was 5 years ago. Now he made his living as a wilderness guide during the summer months, taking small groups into the backcountry, teaching survival skills, sharing just enough of himself to seem present without actually being there. Come October, when the first snows arrived and the tourists disappeared, he retreated to his cabin and spent the winter alone. Reading, chopping wood, watching the world turn white and silent. He liked it that way. The wind picked up, pulling Marcus from his thoughts. He looked west toward the ridgeline. The sky had darkened, clouds rolling in fast and low, the kind that carried weight. He'd seen October storms before. They came early, dumped a foot or two of snow, then moved on. He was prepared. Always was. He had supplies for 3 months, firewood stacked 8 feet high against the north wall, a root cellar full of canned goods, dried meat, flour, beans. He had propane for the stove, oil for the lamps, enough books to last until spring. But something about this storm felt different. The air pressure had dropped sharply overnight. His ears had popped twice that morning. And the birds, they'd gone silent. Not just quiet, silent, like they knew something he didn't. By noon, the first flakes began to fall, soft, lazy, drifting down through the pines. Marcus spent the afternoon securing the cabin, checking the shutters, bringing in extra firewood, filling every container he had with water from the creek before it froze solid. He worked methodically, muscle memory guiding him through tasks he'd performed 100 times before. By evening, the snow was falling harder, thick, heavy flakes that clung to everything. Visibility dropped to maybe 20 feet. The wind howled through the trees, a low moaning sound that made the cabin walls shudder. Marcus lit the fire, heated a can of stew, and settled into his chair by the window, watching the storm consume the world outside. He expected it to pass by morning. It didn't. Day 2 arrived with no break in the weather. The snow had piled 3 feet high against the door. Marcus had to shoulder it open just to check the thermometer. 15 degrees. Wind chill made it feel like 0. The sky was a solid mass of grey, darker and angrier than he'd ever seen. He brought in more wood, rationed his water, and tried not to worry. By day 3, the snow had reached the bottom of the windows, 5 feet, maybe 6. The wind screamed now, shaking the cabin like it wanted to rip it from its foundation. Marcus kept the fire burning, kept himself busy with small tasks, sharpening his knives, organizing supplies, writing in the journal he'd kept since Emily died, though most pages were blank because he had nothing left to say. Day 4. The windows were covered. Darkness pressed against the glass like something alive. Marcus lit the oil lamps and tried to read, but the words swam in front of his eyes. He kept getting up, checking the door, though he couldn't open it anymore. The snow had sealed him in. By day 5, he realized this wasn't just a storm. This was something else, something biblical. The radio, a hand-crank emergency model, picked up nothing but static. No weather reports, no news. Just white noise that matched the white world outside. He tried not to panic. Panic was useless. Panic killed people faster than cold or hunger ever could, but fear, that was harder to control. Fear crept in during the quiet moments, whispered in the spaces between heartbeats. What if the cabin collapsed under the weight? What if the chimney got blocked and carbon monoxide filled the room while he slept? What if he ran out of food before spring? Day 6. The snow had stopped falling, but that almost made it worse, because now Marcus could hear the silence. Total, complete. The kind of silence that existed before humans, before language, before thought. He climbed onto the table and pressed his ear against the ceiling. Nothing but the creak of wood and the weight of snow. So much snow. He did the math in his head. If it had snowed for 5 straight days at the rate he'd seen early on, there could be 20 feet above him, maybe more. The cabin was buried, completely entombed in a frozen mountain, and no one was coming. The ranger station wouldn't check on him until spring. He'd made that clear when he bought the place. He didn't have family. His parents had passed years ago. His friends from his ranger days sent occasional emails he rarely answered. The few people who knew where he lived also knew not to bother him until April at the earliest. He was on his own. Marcus forced himself to stay calm. He inventoried his supplies with careful precision. Canned goods, enough for maybe 90 days if he stretched them. Dried beans and rice, another month. Flour, sugar, salt. Jerky he'd made last summer. He had propane for maybe 6 weeks of cooking. Oil for the lamps would last longer. Firewood was his biggest asset. If he was careful, he could heat the cabin for 4 months, maybe 5. But it was October. Spring wouldn't come until April, maybe May in the high country. That was 6 months, maybe 7. The math didn't work. He sat by the fire that night, staring into the flames, and for the first time since Emily died, he felt genuine fear. Not the dull ache of grief or the hollow emptiness of loss. This was primal, sharp, the fear of an animal trapped in a den with winter closing in. He thought about digging out, but where would he go? The trail down was buried. The nearest town was 15 miles through terrain that would be impossible to navigate in this much snow. Even with snowshoes, even with his experience, he'd die of exposure before he made it halfway. And that was assuming he could even get out of the cabin, which he couldn't. The door opened inward. The weight of the snow against it would make it impossible to move. The windows then. Could he break through a window? Dig a tunnel through the snow? He spent day 7 trying. Using a metal poker from the fireplace, he shattered the glass of the south-facing window and began digging. The snow was packed solid, compressed by its own weight into something closer to ice. He carved out 2 feet before his arms gave out. 2 feet into what might be 20 or 30 feet of snow. It would take days, weeks, and for what? To dig a tunnel to nowhere? He sealed the window back up with boards and nails, stuffed the gaps with rags to keep the cold out, and accepted the truth. He was trapped. The cabin was his prison and his sanctuary. And he would either survive here or die here. There was no in-between. By day 10, Marcus had fallen into a routine. Wake with the sun or what little light filtered through the snow. Keep the fire burning low to conserve wood. Eat one small meal at midday, another at evening. Drink melted snow. Exercise to keep his muscles from atrophying. Push-ups and squats in the small space between the bed and the table. Read when he could focus. Sleep when exhaustion finally pulled him under. But mostly, he thought, about Emily. About the life they'd planned that never happened. About whether she'd be disappointed in how he'd retreated from the world after she left. About whether this was punishment or providence, or just bad luck. The cabin felt smaller every day. The walls pressed in. The ceiling hung lower. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night gasping, convinced he was suffocating, only to realize it was just his mind playing tricks. Cabin fever. Isolation sickness. Whatever name you gave it, the result was the same. Slow madness. He needed a project, something to occupy his mind, something more than just survival. That's when he remembered the floor. The cabin was old, built sometime in the 1920s by miners working a silver claim that had long since played out. The floorboards were rough-cut pine, worn smooth by decades of boots and weather. But there was a section near the back corner, behind the wood stove, where the boards sat slightly higher than the rest. Marcus had noticed it when he first moved in, but never bothered to investigate. Just another quirk of an old building. Now, with nothing but time, he decided to look. He moved the stove, a cast-iron beast that took all his strength to shift even a few inches. Underneath, the floorboards were darker, protected from wear. He knelt down, running his hands over the wood. There. A seam. And another. A square section maybe 3 feet across, fitted so carefully you'd miss it unless you were looking. He found a butter knife and worked it into the gap, prying gently. The boards resisted, then gave with a groan of old nails pulling free. He lifted the section away and stared down into darkness. Cold air rushed up, carrying the smell of earth and stone. Marcus grabbed his flashlight, clicked it on, and pointed it down into the hole. A ladder. Wooden rungs descending into blackness. His heart hammered against his ribs. He'd lived in this cabin for 5 years and never known this was here. A root cellar, maybe. Or a mining shaft. The prospector who sold him the place never mentioned it. Then again, the old man had been half deaf and mostly drunk. Maybe he'd forgotten. Marcus tested the first rung with his weight. It held. He climbed down slowly, the flashlight clenched between his teeth, counting the rungs. 8, 9, 10. The temperature dropped with each step. His breath came out in white clouds. At the bottom, maybe 12 feet down, his boots touched stone. He swept the flashlight around and caught his breath. It was a chamber, maybe 15 feet across, carved from solid rock. The walls were smooth in places, rough in others, showing the marks of pickaxes and hammers. Along one wall, wooden shelves sagged under the weight of old canning jars covered in dust. Some still held preserved vegetables, the contents long since spoiled and black. But that's not what made Marcus freeze. Along the opposite wall, stacked neatly, were crates. Not old, rotting mining crates. These were newer, military green, sealed with metal clasps, maybe a dozen of them, each one about the size of a footlocker. Marcus approached slowly, flashlight beam dancing across the stenciled letters on the nearest crate. No markings, no labels, just plain wood and metal. He knelt down, unclasped the first one, and lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in thick plastic, were stacks of cash, bundled together with rubber bands. All $100 bills. He pulled one bundle out with shaking hands. The bills were old, dated from the 1980s and 90s, but they looked pristine. He counted. 100 bills, $10,000 in his hand. There were at least 30 bundles in the first crate. Marcus sat back hard, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. His mind raced. 300,000 in this crate, 12 crates. Even if they weren't all full, That was millions. Plural. He opened another crate. More cash. A third. Cash and documents, papers sealed in plastic bags. He pulled one out, hands trembling so badly he almost dropped it. Bank statements, land deeds, photographs of men in suits shaking hands. A fourth crate held something different. Small notebooks, the kind accountants used before computers. He opened one randomly and saw columns of numbers, dates, initials, transaction records, payments, bribes maybe. His breath came shallow now. This wasn't lost money. This was hidden money, deliberately concealed. And whoever put it here had done so carefully, methodically, with the intention of coming back for it. But they never did. Marcus climbed back up the ladder and sat on the floor of his cabin, staring at the open hole, his mind spinning. Every instinct he had as a former law enforcement officer told him this was evidence. Criminal proceeds, money from something illegal, something dark, but another part of him, the part that had been counting his dwindling supplies and calculating his odds of surviving the winter, saw something else. A lifeline. He sat there for an hour, maybe more, watching the firelight flicker on the walls, listening to the silence of the buried cabin, and wrestling with a question that had no easy answer. What do you do when you find a fortune in the frozen darkness and there's no one to tell? Marcus didn't sleep that night. He kept climbing down into the chamber, opening crates, trying to understand what he'd found. By the time grey light filtered through the snow-covered windows, he'd counted 8 crates filled entirely with cash. 4 more held documents, photographs, ledgers. 1 contained old hard drives sealed in waterproof bags. The last held something that made his blood run cold. Passports. At least 20 of them, all with different names, different faces, but issued by the same printing source. Forgeries, high-quality ones. He sat on the stone floor of the chamber, surrounded by evidence of crimes he could only guess at, and tried to piece together the story. Someone, or more likely several someones, had used this remote cabin as a dead drop, a place to stash money and records from operations that needed to disappear. The location made sense. 11,000 feet, miles from any road, accessible only by people who knew how to navigate wilderness. The old mining claim gave it legal cover. No one would question a prospector living in the middle of nowhere. But something had gone wrong. The money stayed hidden. The people who put it here never came back. Death? Prison? Or maybe they'd simply forgotten the exact location and couldn't find it again in the vast expanse of the San Juan Mountains. How long had it been here? The dates on the bills ranged from 1983 to 1998. 25 years at least. Maybe longer. Long enough that whoever buried this fortune was likely dead or too old to care. Marcus climbed back up to the cabin as the sun, or what passed for sun through 30 feet of snow, reached its midday peak. He made coffee, hands still shaking slightly, and forced himself to think clearly. The practical side of him knew what he should do. Wait out the winter, survive, then in spring, contact the authorities, turn everything over to the FBI or DEA or whoever handled this kind of thing, let them sort it out, walk away clean. But the buried part of him, the part that had been slowly dying for 5 years, whispered something different. No one knows it's here. No one's looking for it anymore. You could take enough to disappear, to start over, to finally leave behind the ghost of the life you lost. He shook his head, trying to clear the thought. That wasn't him. He'd spent 20 years upholding the law, protecting people, doing the right thing even when it was hard. He wasn't the kind of man who stole, even if it was money that was already stolen. But then again, who was he anymore? The Marcus who'd been a ranger had died with Emily. The man left behind was just going through the motions, waiting for his own end to come. Maybe this was a test, or a chance, or just chaos dressed up as opportunity. He didn't know. What he did know was that he was trapped in a buried cabin with 6 months of winter ahead and supplies that wouldn't last. The money didn't change that immediate reality. You couldn't eat cash, couldn't burn it for warmth, not efficiently anyway. His survival still depended on rationing, discipline, and luck. But it changed something else. It changed hope. Because now, if he made it through this winter, he had options. He could walk away from the mountains if he wanted, could build something new, could honor Emily's memory in ways he'd been too broken to consider before. Or he could do the right thing and turn it all in. The choice sat heavy on his shoulders. For now, though, the choice didn't matter. What mattered was surviving the next day, and the day after that, and all the frozen days between now and spring. He closed the hatch in the floor, moved the stove back into place, and returned to his routine. But everything felt different now. The cabin wasn't just his prison anymore, it was a vault, and he was both prisoner and guardian. The days blurred together. Marcus kept a careful tally on the wall, scratching a mark into the wood each morning. Day 15, day 20, day 25. November arrived, though he had no way to know it except by his count. The temperature inside the cabin stayed just above freezing when the fire burned. At night, it dropped below. He slept in all his clothes, buried under blankets Emily had made, and dreamed of warmth. His supplies dwindled slowly. He'd gotten good at rationing, at making a single can of beans last 2 days, at eating just enough to keep his body functional without satisfying the constant gnawing hunger. The propane ran out on day 32. After that, all his cooking happened over the wood fire, which meant more wood burned, which meant his fuel supply dropped faster than planned. He went down into the chamber often now. Not to count the money, that felt wrong somehow, but to think. The cold stone room became his refuge when the cabin walls pressed too close. He'd sit on the floor, flashlight turned low to save batteries, and let his mind wander through the maze of questions that had no answers. By day 40, he'd read every book in the cabin twice. By day 50, he'd stopped reading altogether. The words meant nothing anymore. He exercised more, pushing his body until exhaustion forced sleep. He talked to himself sometimes, just to hear a human voice. He talked to Emily's memory, apologizing for things he couldn't name. The isolation was worse than the hunger, worse than the cold. It was a slow dissolving of self, like he was becoming part of the cabin, part of the mountain, part of the silent, frozen world that pressed down from above. One night, sometime around day 60, Marcus woke from a dream where Emily was calling to him. Her voice echoed through the cabin, clear as morning light. He sat up, heart pounding, and for a moment he believed she was there, really there. He called her name into the darkness. Only silence answered. He buried his face in his hands and wept for the first time since her funeral. Great shaking sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. He cried for her, for himself, for the life they'd lost and the man he'd become, for the choices he'd made and the ones still waiting in the frozen darkness below. When the tears finally stopped, he felt hollow but clean, like a wound that had finally been drained. He got out of bed, lit a lamp, and climbed down into the chamber one more time. He opened the crate with the ledgers and began to read them carefully, systematically, trying to understand the story they told. The entries went back to 1978, payments to officials, shipments of something marked only with weights and destinations, money moving through channels that deliberately obscured their origin. The more he read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just hidden money. This was evidence of something massive. Organized crime. Drug trafficking, maybe, or worse. And somewhere in these pages were names. Real names. People who might still be alive. People who might still be powerful. People who would kill to keep this buried. Marcus closed the ledger and looked up at the rough stone ceiling above him. He was sitting on something that could destroy lives, topple careers, rewrite criminal histories. And come spring, he'd have to decide what to do with it. But that was a problem for the future. Right now, in the frozen present, he was just a man trying not to starve in a buried cabin, counting the days until thaw, hoping he'd counted right, hoping spring would come before his body gave out, hoping that whatever choices waited ahead, he'd have the strength to make them. The fire crackled upstairs, his stomach growled, the mountain pressed down from all sides, 30 feet of snow and ice, and waiting. Marcus climbed the ladder, sealed the hatch, and returned to the simple equation that governed his life now. Survive today. Worry about tomorrow when tomorrow comes. If tomorrow comes. Day 63 came with a silence so complete Marcus could hear his own heartbeat. He'd been rationing his meals down to portions that barely qualified as food. A quarter can of beans, 3 crackers, a strip of jerky so tough he had to suck on it for an hour before his teeth could tear through. His body had started consuming itself weeks ago. He could feel it in the looseness of his clothes, the way his belt had to be notched tighter every few days, the hollow ache in his joints that never quite went away. But his mind stayed sharp. Too sharp, maybe. Because now, with nothing else to occupy his thoughts, he couldn't stop thinking about what lay beneath his feet. The chamber had become an obsession, a puzzle he needed to solve not because it mattered for survival, but because it was the only thing that made him feel alive. That morning, after forcing down a breakfast of stale crackers and melted snow, Marcus moved the stove aside and descended into the darkness. He'd brought a notebook this time, one of Emily's old journals that he'd never been able to fill, and a pencil. If he was going to understand this, he needed to document it properly. The ranger in him, the investigator, demanded order. The chamber looked the same as always, cold, stone, silent. But now Marcus saw it differently, not as a hiding place, but as a crime scene. And crime scenes told stories if you knew how to read them. He started with the crates, examining them more carefully than before. Military surplus, probably purchased from government auctions in the 1970s or 80s. Each one had a serial number stamped into the wood, but someone had sanded them down, tried to make them untraceable. The metal clasps were standard issue, nothing special, nothing that would draw attention. But the way they were stacked told him something. The ones in back, pressed against the stone wall, were older. Dust had settled thicker there. The ones closer to the ladder were newer, cleaner. Someone had been adding to this collection over time, years probably. This wasn't a one-time drop, this was an operation. Marcus opened the first crate again, the one he'd looked at that first night. The money still shocked him. Bundles of hundreds, vacuum sealed in plastic, preserved perfectly by the cold. He counted more carefully this time. 40 bundles, 10,000 each, $400,000 in this crate alone. He worked through each one methodically, counting, recording. Crate 2, 380,000. Crate 3, 420,000. By the time he finished the 8 crates that held only cash, his hand was shaking so badly he could barely write. $3.2 million. He set the pencil down and stared at the number he'd written. 3.2 million. More money than he'd make in 10 lifetimes. More money than most people ever saw, just sitting here in the dark, waiting. But it was the other crates that really mattered. The ones with the documents, the evidence. Marcus pulled out the first ledger again and started reading from the beginning. The handwriting was cramped, precise, the letters formed by someone who'd learned to write in a time when penmanship mattered. The first entry was dated June 12, 1978. Delivery received, 40 units. Payment processed through secondary channel, 15,000 total. That was it. No names, no locations, just units and dollars. But as Marcus read further, a pattern emerged. Deliveries happened roughly monthly, sometimes twice a month. The units varied, 10 here, 60 there, once 120. The payments grew larger over time. By 1982, single deliveries were bringing in 50,000. By 1987, 100,000. And the operation expanded. New channels opened, secondary became tertiary, then quaternary. The money flowed through multiple streams, deliberately complicated, designed to obscure the source. But the ledger tracked it all with meticulous precision. Someone wanted a record, insurance maybe, or evidence to use if things went wrong. Marcus turned to the photographs next. Most were innocuous. Men in suits standing in front of buildings, handshakes at what looked like business dinners. But a few stood out. One showed a small airplane on a dirt runway, several men loading boxes into the cargo hold. Another showed a warehouse interior, pallets stacked high with unmarked crates. A third caught his attention because he recognized the location. It was taken in Denver, outside what used to be the federal building. 2 men, one in a police uniform, the other in a suit, both smiling at the camera. The uniform sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This wasn't just criminals hiding money. Law enforcement was involved. How deep did this go? He moved to the hard drives next. 4 of them, each sealed in a waterproof bag with desiccant packets to prevent moisture damage. Professional work. Someone had known these drives would sit in cold storage for years, maybe decades, and had taken steps to preserve them. What was on them? Financial records, communications, video evidence? Marcus had no way to access them, no computer, no power. They were just plastic and metal to him now, but they represented something bigger. Whoever compiled this archive had been thorough. Everything that could prove what happened was here. Bank statements showing money laundering, photographs showing participants, ledgers showing the flow. And somewhere in those encrypted hard drives, probably the final pieces that tied it all together. He opened the crate with the passports and spread them out on the stone floor. 23 total, each one perfect. Different names, different birth dates, but similar quality. High-grade forgeries, the kind that could pass border inspections. Escape routes. These were meant for people who knew they might need to vanish someday, but they never used them. Marcus sat back against the cold stone wall, his breath misting in the flashlight beam. He closed his eyes and let his mind work through what he knew. A criminal organization, probably drug trafficking based on the language in the ledgers, had operated from the late 70s through at least the late 90s. They'd moved massive amounts of product and money through Colorado, probably using the Rocky Mountain region as a distribution hub. They'd paid off officials, law enforcement, maybe judges or prosecutors, and they'd hidden evidence of all of it here, in this chamber, in this remote cabin. Then something happened. The operation shut down. Maybe they got busted. Maybe someone died. Maybe they just retired. But they never came back for the money or the evidence. It had sat here for more than 20 years, frozen in time, waiting. And now Marcus, a broken-down former ranger who just wanted to be left alone, was sitting on the biggest find of his life. He thought about his training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. He'd been 23, fresh out of college, full of idealism about protecting wilderness and serving the public. They'd taught him how to investigate crimes, how to preserve evidence, how to follow procedures. He'd been good at it too. Rose through the ranks faster than most. By 30, he was leading search and rescue operations. By 35, he was training new rangers. He remembered a case from 2008. A group of hunters had found a meth lab hidden in Rocky Mountain National Park, buried in a cave system near Trail Ridge Road. Marcus had been the one to call it in, secure the scene, work with DEA agents to process everything. They'd arrested 17 people in the end, shut down a production operation that had been running for 3 years. He'd been proud of that work, proud of making a difference. Emily had been proud too. She'd kissed him that night and told him he was one of the good ones, a man who stood for something. What would she think of him now, sitting in the dark with millions in stolen money, debating whether to even report it? The thought made his chest ache. Emily had been his conscience, his compass. When he got cynical about bureaucracy or frustrated with politics, she'd reminded him why the work mattered. She'd believed in him even when he stopped believing in himself. He pulled out his wedding ring from where it hung on a chain around his neck. He'd stopped wearing it on his finger after the first winter alone, afraid he'd lose it somehow. But he kept it close, always. He rubbed his thumb across the worn gold, remembering. Their wedding had been in a meadow near Grand Lake. 20 guests, wildflowers, her in a simple white dress that caught the wind. He'd cried when she walked toward him. Actually cried. She'd teased him about it for years. Big tough ranger, she'd say, brought to his knees by a girl in a sundress. Not just any girl, he'd always respond. The girl, the only girl. She'd wanted children. He'd been the one hesitant, worried about raising kids on a ranger's salary, worried about the dangers of the job. He'd said they had time. They'd said they'd start trying after he got promoted, after they saved more money, after. Then the cancer came, and after became never. Marcus wiped his eyes, angry at himself for crying again. He'd thought he was done with tears. thought he'd bled out all the grief years ago. But apparently not. Apparently it was still there, just waiting for a quiet moment to crack him open. He forced himself to focus. The past was gone. Emily was gone. All he had was now, this frozen present, and the impossible choice in front of him. What happens next will turn this winter upside down, reveal a truth that could destroy powerful people, and remind us why sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that define who we really are. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus spent hours in the chamber that day, going through every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence. He found bank account numbers from the Cayman Islands, wire transfer receipts from Mexico City, Panama, 36 offshore banks. Names started appearing in the later ledgers. Initials at first, then full names. Ramon, Carrera, Di Stefano, Chen. Names that meant nothing to him now, but had probably meant everything to whoever compiled this archive. One folder contained newspaper clippings, articles about drug busts in Denver, Pueblo, Colorado Springs, stories about task force operations. Each clipping had a date written in the margin and a brief note. Close call, moved operations south. Lost distribution point, established new route. The organization had been tracking law enforcement, staying one step ahead. Another folder held something that made Marcus's blood run cold. Photographs of bodies, not crime scene photos. These were different. Personal. Polaroids. Men and women, their faces beaten, bullet holes visible. Each photo had a name written on the back and a single word, resolved. These were kills, executions. People who'd threatened the operation or betrayed it or simply knew too much. Marcus counted them. 11 photographs. 11 lives ended and documented like they were transactions in the ledger. He thought about calling the FBI immediately, as soon as he got out. These families deserve to know what happened to their loved ones. These crimes deserve to be answered for. But another voice in his head whispered caution. The dates on these photos ranged from 1981 to 1997, more than 25 years ago. The statute of limitations had probably expired on some of these. The people responsible were likely dead or in prison already, or living under new identities in countries without extradition. And if law enforcement had been compromised back then, who's to say it was clean now? What if he turned this over and it disappeared? What if the wrong people found out what he'd discovered? Marcus climbed back upstairs as evening shadows deepened the darkness in the cabin. He'd been down there for 8 hours. His body was stiff with cold, his fingers nearly numb despite his gloves. He rebuilt the fire, boiled water for the last of his instant coffee, and sat by the stove trying to warm himself. The moral weight of the discovery pressed on him like the snow above. This wasn't his to keep. It wasn't his choice to make about what happened to it. The right thing, the only thing, was to report it and let proper authorities sort it out. But the money. God. The money kept whispering to him in the quiet moments. $3.2 million. Think what you could do with that. Think how many problems it would solve. You could honor Emily's memory, build something good, help people who actually needed help. Isn't that better than letting it sit in some evidence locker for years while lawyers fight over it? He shook his head, disgusted with himself. Those were the rationalizations of criminals. He knew that. He'd heard them 1,000 times from people he'd arrested. Everyone had a good reason for breaking the law. Everyone convinced themselves they were the exception. But he also knew he was starving, that his supplies were running out faster than planned, that he'd lost at least 30 pounds and winter was only half over, that survival was no longer guaranteed. The money couldn't fix that immediate problem, but knowing it was there changed something psychological. It gave him a reason to fight harder to survive. Because if he made it through this winter, he had choices, real choices, not the slow fade into nothing he'd been accepting before. Marcus pulled out Emily's journal and began to write. Not about the money or the evidence, about her, about memories he needed to preserve before they faded completely. He wrote about their first date, a hike up to Chasm Lake where they'd gotten caught in a thunderstorm and huddled under a rock overhang. laughing as lightning cracked overhead. He wrote about the way she sang off-key in the shower, the way she'd fall asleep reading, her book slowly sliding off her chest, the way she'd looked at him in the hospital those final days, still smiling, still telling him everything would be okay, even though they both knew it wouldn't. He wrote until his hand cramped and the pencil wore down. Then he closed the journal and held it against his chest, feeling the weight of her absence settle over him like it did every night. "I don't know what to do," he whispered into the darkness. "I don't know who I am anymore without you." The fire crackled. The cabin groaned under its burden of snow. No answer came because no answer existed. Day 67. Marcus woke to find ice had formed on the inside of the windows overnight. The temperature had dropped to something brutal, maybe 10 below even with the fire. He burned extra wood just to get the cabin to a survivable temperature, knowing each log he added was one less for later. His breakfast was 2 crackers and a handful of dried berries he'd foraged last summer. Lunch would be half a can of soup. Dinner, if he had the strength to cook, would be beans and a piece of jerky. He was eating maybe 800 calories a day. His body needed 3 times that. The math wasn't complicated. He was dying slowly. Not from cold, not from any single dramatic failure, but from the cumulative weight of deprivation. His body was cannibalizing muscle tissue. His thinking had slowed. He forgot things now, simple things like whether he'd already added wood to the fire or if he'd locked the storage trunk. Starvation affected the brain before it killed the body. Marcus went down into the chamber again that afternoon, not to look at the evidence, but simply to move, to do something other than sit and wait. He'd started doing exercises down there, push-ups and sit-ups on the cold stone, just to keep blood flowing. But even that was getting harder. His muscles screamed with less effort. His breath came shorter. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, and stared at the crates. The money mocked him. All that wealth, and he couldn't buy a single calorie. Couldn't purchase warmth or safety. It was useless. Completely useless. The most valuable thing in this chamber wasn't the cash. It was the old jars of preserved vegetables on the shelves, even though they'd probably kill him if he tried to eat them after so many years. A thought occurred to him then, desperate and dark. If he didn't survive the winter, all of this disappeared again. The evidence, the truth about what happened, the families of those 11 victims, they'd never get closure. The criminals, whoever was still alive, they'd never face justice. It would all just be buried again, this time permanently. He couldn't let that happen. Marcus climbed back upstairs and searched through his supplies until he found what he needed. A waterproof bag, the kind designed for river rafting. He packed it carefully with copies of the most important documents, photographs of the ledger pages he'd taken with his old camera, a written summary of everything he'd found. He included the folder with the victim photos. He sealed it all carefully, then went outside through the broken window he'd tried to dig through weeks ago. The tunnel was still there, a narrow shaft extending a few feet into the snow. He pushed the bag as far into the tunnel as he could reach, then packed snow around it, marking the location by scratching an X into the wooden window frame. If he died, maybe someone would find this eventually. Maybe the truth would come out even without him. It was a long shot, but it was something. Back inside, Marcus made a decision. He would focus on survival first. Nothing else mattered if he didn't make it to spring. The questions about the money, about what to report and when, about right and wrong, those could wait. His body couldn't. He took inventory again, this time brutally honest. Food remaining, enough for maybe 30 more days at current rations. Firewood, 60 days if he was very careful, maybe 70 if he burned less and stayed colder. But March was still 2 months away. April more likely for the thaw to reach this elevation. The math didn't work, unless he did something different. Marcus remembered his survival training. In extreme situations, you had to think creatively, use every resource. The chamber, he'd been thinking of it as a hiding place, but it was also warmer than the cabin. The earth itself provided insulation. If he moved his sleeping setup down there, he could let the cabin go cold, conserve firewood. He spent the next several days preparing. He carried his sleeping bag and blankets down into the chamber, moved some supplies, set up a small camping stove that used less fuel than the wood fire. The space was cramped and dark and felt like a tomb, but it was 5 degrees warmer on average. He started spending nights down there, curled up between crates full of money, surrounded by evidence of crimes that happened before he even became a ranger. It was surreal, absurd. A former law enforcement officer sleeping on a fortune, starving in the dark, waiting for spring. But it worked. His wood consumption dropped by half. He could stretch his supplies longer. Day 74, Marcus found himself talking to the chamber like it was alive. "Just you and me," he'd say to the stone walls. "Two things that shouldn't exist but do." He'd laugh at his own jokes, the sound hollow and strange in the enclosed space. The isolation was breaking him in new ways. He could feel his grip on sanity slipping one day at a time. He'd have conversations with Emily, full dialogues where he played both parts. He'd argue with himself about the money, switching positions mid-sentence. The ranger in him demanded he report everything. The survivor whispered that rules were for people who had the luxury of following them. One night, maybe day 80 or 85, he lost track. Marcus woke from a dream so vivid he couldn't separate it from reality. Emily had been there, standing in the chamber, glowing softly like she was made of light. She'd told him something important, something about choices and forgiveness and letting go. But when he sat up, gasping, the words evaporated like frost in sunlight. He was alone. Still alone. Always alone. Marcus picked up one of the bundles of cash and held it in his hands. $10,000, more than he used to make in 2 months as a ranger. What could someone do with $10,000? Pay off debt, buy a used car, cover medical bills. What could someone do with $3 million? Change a life, multiple lives, fund causes, make a real difference, or poison their soul trying. He put the money back and climbed up to the cabin. Dawn was coming, or what passed for dawn, under 30 feet of snow. Another day of survival ahead. Another day of hunger and cold and waiting. Another day of wrestling with questions that had no clean answers. But he was still alive, still fighting. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the starvation and the isolation and the impossible moral weight, Marcus Hale remembered something important. He'd survived worse than this. He'd survived losing Emily. He'd survived the aftermath, the grief that swallowed him whole. If he could survive that, he could survive anything, even himself. Day 104 arrived with a sound Marcus had almost forgotten. Dripping. Water running somewhere above, trickling down the walls of the cabin in thin streams that caught the lamplight. He sat up in his sleeping bag down in the chamber, listening with an intensity that made his heart race. The thaw had begun. He climbed the ladder faster than he had in weeks, his weakened muscles protesting. The cabin was still dark, still buried, but he could hear it now. The mountain was weeping. Somewhere above, 30 feet of compacted snow was beginning to surrender to the March sun. It would be slow, painfully slow, but it was happening. Marcus pressed his ear against the ceiling and heard it more clearly. The groan of settling snow, the crack of ice breaking, the whisper of meltwater finding channels through the frozen mass. Spring was coming. After 104 days of being buried alive, the world was finally reaching for him. He should have felt relief, joy, something. But what he felt instead was terror. Because now he had to face the choice he'd been avoiding all winter. Now the hypothetical became real. What would he do about what he'd found? The next week passed in agonizing increments. Each day the sounds grew louder. More water, more movement. The snow was compacting, melting from within, creating voids and channels. Marcus measured his ceiling height obsessively. Had it lowered an inch? 2 inches? Was the weight decreasing, or was he imagining it? His supplies were nearly gone. He'd stretched them as far as humanly possible, but physics didn't negotiate. Day 108, he ate the last can of beans. Day 110, the final package of crackers. After that, he was down to a handful of dried rice, some flour that had gotten damp and moldy, and 3 pieces of jerky he'd been saving like they were gold. He'd lost close to 50 pounds. His clothes hung on him like they belonged to someone else. His face, when he glimpsed it in the small mirror he used for shaving, looked skeletal. Cheekbones sharp as blades, eyes sunken deep, beard grown wild and shot through with grey. He looked like a ghost, felt like one too, but he was close now, so close. The ceiling groaned louder each day. Light, actual daylight, had started penetrating through cracks. Not much, just thin beams that cut through the darkness like hope made visible. The snow was thinning. Day 114. Marcus woke to a crash that shook the entire cabin. He scrambled out of the chamber in time to see the south wall buckle inward. Snow, heavy and wet, poured through gaps in the boards. He grabbed what he could, the emergency bag, Emily's journal, some clothes, and retreated into the chamber, pulling the hatch closed above him. The cabin might not survive the thaw. The weight of settling snow could crush it completely. He'd be safer underground until he could dig out. He spent that day and the next in the chamber, listening to his home of 5 years being destroyed above him. Boards snapped, glass shattered. The sound of avalanche, small and contained but devastating, filled his ears. He sat among the crates of money and evidence, surrounded by the fruits of someone else's crimes, and wondered if this was how it ended. Not frozen, not starved, but crushed under the weight of melting snow while sitting on a fortune he couldn't spend. But on day 116, something changed. The crashes stopped, the groaning quieted, and then, faintly, he heard it. Birds, actual birds singing somewhere above. The sound was so foreign after months of silence that Marcus thought he was hallucinating. But no, there it was again. A mountain chickadee, calling its name like a prayer. He climbed the ladder and pushed on the hatch. It moved slightly. He pushed harder. The stove above had shifted in the collapse, but he could move it. Inch by inch, he forced the hatch open and emerged into devastation. The cabin was ruins. The south wall had collapsed entirely. The roof sagged dangerously, held up only by the stone chimney. Snow still filled half the space, but it was wet snow now, melting actively, and he could see sky. Actual sky through the broken roof, blue and bright and impossibly beautiful. Marcus climbed over debris to what remained of the door. It still wouldn't open inward, but the wall around it had cracked. He grabbed a piece of broken timber and used it as a lever, prying at the frame. Wood splintered. The door frame separated from the wall. He pulled with strength he didn't know he still had. The door gave way suddenly, and he stumbled backward. Light flooded in. Real sunlight, warm and golden. And beyond the doorway, where there had been a solid wall of snow, was now a tunnel. The snow had melted and compacted into an arch maybe 4 feet high. He could see through it. 20 feet. 30. And at the end, the world. Marcus dropped to his knees and wept. Not sad tears this time. These were something else. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. He'd made it. Against odds that should have killed him, he'd survived. But as the tears dried and reality settled back in, the weight returned. Because now he had to decide. And he was out of time to avoid that decision. He spent the rest of that day preparing. He packed a bag with the most critical evidence, copies of ledgers, key photographs, bank documents, the hard drives. The rest he sealed back in the crates and hid them in the chamber again. If he reported this, federal agents would come. They'd find it all. But he wanted to control the narrative, wanted to be the one who brought it to them, not the other way around. He slept one more night in the ruins of his cabin, his last night on the mountain before rejoining the world. He dreamed of Emily. In the dream, she sat beside him on the porch that no longer existed, watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and red. She didn't say anything, just took his hand and held it, and somehow that was enough. Dawn broke on day 117. Marcus shouldered his pack, took one last look at the chamber through the broken floor, and stepped into the tunnel. The snow walls were solid enough, compressed by their own weight. He moved carefully, testing each step. The pack was heavy. The evidence weighed more than just pounds. He emerged into blinding brightness. The world had transformed. Where there had been endless white, now patches of brown earth showed through. Meltwater ran in dozens of tiny streams, converging into creeks that hadn't existed 4 months ago. The pines stood tall and dark against the blue sky, their branches finally free of snow's burden. The trail down was invisible, buried under feet of remaining snow and covered with debris from avalanches. But Marcus knew these mountains, had walked them for years. He oriented himself by the peaks, found landmarks, and started descending. His legs trembled with each step. His pack felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His body was so depleted that even walking was a monumental effort, but he walked anyway. The hike that normally took 3 hours took him all day. He had to rest every 15 minutes, sitting on rocks, gasping, forcing his body to continue. Twice he nearly blacked out. Once he slipped on wet stone and slid 20 feet before catching himself on a tree. But he kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and he hadn't survived all winter just to die within sight of salvation. The sun was setting when he finally reached the trailhead. His truck sat exactly where he'd left it, now clear of snow, looking small and ordinary and impossibly precious. He'd left the keys in the ignition. No one came up here in winter. The battery was dead, of course. 4 months in sub-zero temperatures had killed it. But he didn't need the truck. He just needed to rest. Marcus collapsed against the tailgate and stared back up at the mountain. Somewhere up there, buried in the ruins of his cabin, was $3 million and evidence of crimes that had gone unanswered for decades, and in his pack he carried enough to prove it all. The weight of the decision pressed on him like the snow had pressed on his cabin. Report it and become part of something bigger than himself. Keep it hidden and walk away with money that could change his life. He pulled out his satellite phone, the emergency one he always carried for backcountry work. The battery was low but functional. He could make 1 call, maybe 2. His finger hovered over the keypad. What happens next will turn his survival story into a national scandal, reveal corruption that reaches higher than anyone imagined, and force Marcus to choose between the law he once served and the life he could finally rebuild. Stay with us to see what he decides. If you're hooked on this story, please hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss how this ends. Marcus stared at the phone for a long time. The sun had set, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. The same stars that had existed above him all winter, hidden by 30 feet of snow and frozen time. He thought about Emily, about what she would tell him to do. But he realized he already knew. She'd always been his conscience, but the choice now had to be his own. He dialed 911. The operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? Marcus's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm a former park ranger. I've been trapped in a buried cabin in the San Juan Mountains for the past 4 months. I need immediate assistance. There was a pause. Sir, can you repeat that? You said trapped for 4 months? Yes, and I've discovered evidence of criminal activity. Major criminal activity. I need to speak with the FBI. Another pause, longer this time. He could hear the confusion in her voice. Sir, I'm dispatching emergency services to your location. Can you tell me where you are exactly? Marcus gave her the coordinates of the trailhead. But the emergency services I need aren't medical. I need federal law enforcement. What I found, it's evidence from a drug trafficking operation. Millions of dollars and documents. I need the FBI. Now. Sir, I'm going to connect you with the sheriff's department. Stay on the line. The next hour was a blur of phone calls. First the county sheriff, then a state investigator, then finally, near midnight, an FBI field agent from the Denver office. Marcus told the story again and again, each time trying to convey the scale of what he'd found without sounding insane. The agent, a woman named Sandra Chen, listened carefully. Mr. Hale, I'm going to send agents to your location immediately. Do not touch anything else. Do not speak to anyone about this. We'll have people there by morning. I'm not at the cabin anymore, Marcus said. I'm at the trailhead. The cabin is a 3-hour hike up. and it's partially collapsed. We'll bring a helicopter at first light. Mr. Hale, you're saying you found over $3 million in cash. 3.2 million, and evidence. Documents, photographs, digital records. It looks like a drug operation from the 80s and 90s. There are also photographs of what I believe are murder victims. He could hear her inhale sharply. Jesus, okay, stay where you are. We're sending a team. The sheriff arrived first, just after midnight. Deputy Mike Hollis, a man Marcus knew vaguely from town. Mike brought water, food, and blankets. He took one look at Marcus and immediately called for an ambulance. Jesus Christ, Marcus, you look like you've been dead for weeks. Feel like it too, Marcus managed. The food, just crackers and cheese, tasted like heaven. But his stomach, shrunken from months of starvation, could only handle a few bites before rebelling. The paramedics wanted to take him to the hospital immediately. Marcus refused. I need to be here when the FBI arrives. I need to take them to the site. Sir, you need medical attention. You're severely malnourished. Your vitals are concerning. I've been severely malnourished for 4 months. Another few hours won't kill me. They compromised. The paramedics set up an IV to get fluids into him, checked him over, but agreed to let him stay until the federal agents arrived. Marcus sat in the back of the ambulance, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars, and waiting for his life to change forever. The helicopter came with the dawn. It landed in the meadow near the trailhead, rotors whipping the new grass. 4 people climbed out. Agent Chen, 2 other FBI investigators, and a Forest Service ranger who knew the terrain. Chen was mid-40s, Korean-American, with sharp eyes that assessed everything. She walked straight to Marcus. Mr. Hale? He nodded, too exhausted to stand. I'm Agent Chen. These are Agents Morrison and Gutierrez. We need you to take us to the location. I can take you there, but I'm not sure I can make the hike again. I barely made it down yesterday. The helicopter can get us closer. There's a clearing about a mile from the cabin coordinates you gave us. Can you guide us from there? Marcus nodded. Yeah, I can do that. The flight was surreal. Marcus watched the mountains slide by below, the same peaks he'd stared at through his window all winter. From above, he could see the cabin's location marked by the collapsed roof and the disturbed snow around it. It looked impossibly small, impossibly remote. How had he survived there? They landed in the clearing. The hike to the cabin was steep but short. Agent Chen kept glancing at Marcus with concern. He was moving slowly, leaning on a walking stick Mike had given him. But he was moving. When they reached the cabin, or what remained of it, the agents stopped and stared. The collapse was more dramatic than Marcus had realized. Only the stone chimney and part of the north wall still stood. The rest was a jumble of broken timber and melting snow. The entrance to the chamber is in there, Marcus said, pointing to where the floor would be under the debris. Stay here, Chen ordered. Morrison, Gutierrez, with me. Let's clear a path. It took them an hour to move enough debris to reach the hatch. Marcus watched from a safe distance as Chen descended the ladder, flashlight in hand. She was down there for maybe 10 minutes. When she emerged, her face was pale. Holy shit, she breathed. It's real. It's all real. The next 2 days turned into a controlled chaos. More FBI agents arrived. Forensic teams, evidence technicians. They set up a base camp in the meadow and began the painstaking work of documenting and removing everything from the chamber. Marcus gave his statement over and over, answering the same questions from different people. Where did you find it? When? Did you touch anything? Did you remove anything? He told them about the bag he'd packed, showed them what he'd taken. They bagged it as evidence, gave him a receipt. He was now officially a witness in a federal investigation. Agent Chen pulled him aside on the second day. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you something directly. Did you take any of the money? Marcus looked her in the eye. No, I thought about it. God knows I thought about it. But no. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. I believe you. Most people wouldn't have reported this at all. They would have taken the money and disappeared. I'm not most people. I'm a former ranger. I know what this evidence means. People died. Families deserve answers. They do, she agreed. And because of you, they might finally get them. The media found out on day 3. Marcus never figured out how. Someone at the sheriff's department, probably, or maybe a Forest Service employee. But suddenly, reporters were showing up at the trailhead, trying to hike up to the cabin. The FBI set up a perimeter and kicked them all out, but the story was already spreading. Mountain man finds fortune in buried cabin. Recluse survives 4-month ordeal, discovers millions. FBI investigates massive cache of drug money in remote Colorado cabin. By day 4, it was national news. CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all of them were covering it. Helicopters flew over the site, trying to get footage. Reporters called everyone who'd ever known Marcus, his old colleagues from the Park Service, people from town. They even found Emily's parents and harassed them for interviews about their dead daughter's husband. Marcus, meanwhile, was in the hospital in Durango. The doctors had finally insisted. He was suffering from severe malnutrition, dehydration, frostbite on 2 toes, and something they called refeeding syndrome, where his body struggled to process food after such prolonged starvation. They kept him for observation, running tests, forcing him to eat small amounts every few hours. Agent Chen visited him there on day 6. She brought news. "We've identified the operation," she said, sitting beside his bed. "The ledgers you found, we've been able to cross-reference them with old case files. This was the Cordova organization. Miguel Cordova ran one of the largest cocaine distribution networks in the Southwest from 1976 to 1998. Marcus leaned forward. "I remember that name. There was a big bust in 98, made national news." Chen nodded. "Operation Snowblind. DEA and FBI coordinated it. Brought down most of the organization. Cordova himself died in prison in 2003. But the case always had loose ends. Money that was never recovered. Associates who got away. This cache, it fills in a lot of those gaps." "What about the photographs? The victims?" Her expression darkened. "We're working on identifying them. Some match with cold cases from the 80s and 90s. Missing persons, unsolved murders. You may have just given us the evidence to close a dozen cases. And the law enforcement corruption. I saw photos of cops." "That's going to be more complicated. Some of those people are dead, some are retired. But there are a few still active. We're being very careful about who sees what. This investigation is now classified at the highest level." Marcus nodded slowly. "What happens to me?" "What do you mean? Am I in trouble for not reporting it immediately?" Chen considered the question. "Technically, you could argue you were in survival mode. You were trapped, starving, fighting to stay alive. The discovery didn't change your circumstances. You reported it as soon as you were physically able to do so." She paused. "But there are going to be questions. A lot of people are going to want to know why you didn't somehow signal for help earlier, why you didn't find a way to report it during the winter." "There was no way. I was completely buried. No phone signal, no radio, no nothing." "I know, and that's what we'll tell the prosecutors. But Marcus, I need you to understand something. You're sitting on the biggest drug money recovery in Colorado history. That money, legally, it belongs to the government. But there are going to be lawyers who argue otherwise. Civil forfeiture laws are complicated. There's going to be pressure from multiple directions." "I don't want the money," Marcus said. "I never wanted it." "You say that now, but wait until you see what's coming." She was right. By the second week, the hospital room had become a siege. Lawyers showed up, uninvited, offering to represent Marcus in claims against the government. "That money was found on your property," they argued. "You have rights to it. We can get you millions." Marcus threw them all out. Then came the families, distant relatives of Miguel Cordova and his associates, claiming that the money had been stolen from their loved ones and should be returned to them. They threatened lawsuits, held press conferences, painted Marcus as a thief who was stealing from grieving families. The government filed its own claim, of course. The Department of Justice argued that all the money was proceeds from criminal activity and therefore subject to forfeiture. They wanted every dollar. And then there were the more sinister visitors, men in expensive suits who didn't give their names, who suggested quietly that Marcus might want to reconsider his cooperation with the FBI, who implied that talking about certain things, certain names, could be very dangerous for his health. Agent Chen had him moved to a secure location, a safe house in Denver, guarded by federal marshals. "Until we sort out who's threatening you and why," she explained. Marcus felt like he was drowning. All he'd wanted was to survive the winter, to honor the law he'd once served. And now he was caught in a whirlwind of legal battles, media circuses, and threats from people who wanted the evidence to disappear. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The hard drives, once analyzed, contained detailed financial records that connected the Cordova organization to dozens of legitimate businesses, banks, and officials. Names started coming out: a retired judge in New Mexico, a former state senator, 3 current DEA agents who had been rookies in the 90s but had somehow accumulated wealth far beyond their salaries. The indictment started in week 3, 7 people arrested, 10 more under investigation. The news cycle exploded again. This wasn't just about finding money. This was about exposing systemic corruption that had survived for decades. And at the center of it all was Marcus Hale, the mountain man who just wanted to be left alone. The town of Silverton, the nearest community to his cabin, became divided. Some saw Marcus as a hero. He'd done the right thing, reported a crime, helped bring justice. Local bar owners bought him drinks when he finally returned. Strangers thanked him on the street, but others saw him differently. He'd brought federal agents and media attention to their quiet town. He'd exposed Colorado's dark underbelly and made them all look bad. Some muttered that he should have kept his mouth shut. A few said openly that he should have taken the money and left. "Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble," one old-timer said at Thompson's feed store. The debate became philosophical. What would you do? If you found $3 million in cash, would you report it? Could you report it? Or would you convince yourself that sometimes survival trumps morality? Marcus heard all of it, the praise and the criticism, the speculation about his motives. Some people suggested he'd only reported it because he was too weak to carry the money out himself. Others claimed he was angling for a reward, that his cooperation was just another form of greed. The reward question came up officially in week 4. A lawyer from the Justice Department explained it to him. Under federal law, you may be entitled to up to 25% of recovered funds as a whistleblower reward. In this case, that could amount to $800,000. Marcus sat in stunned silence. $800,000. More money than he'd ever dreamed of having. More than enough to rebuild his life. To honor Emily's memory properly. To create something good from all this chaos. "What do I have to do?" he asked. "Nothing," the lawyer said. "You've already done it. Once all the legal proceedings are complete, assuming you're awarded the reward, it's yours. No strings attached." But there were always strings. Marcus learned that quickly. Accepting the reward meant being part of the narrative. The government would parade him as an example of civic duty. The media would analyze his every move. He'd never be anonymous again, never be just another face in the wilderness. And some part of him mourned that loss more than he'd mourned anything since Emily. Agent Chen sat with him one evening in the safe house. They'd formed an odd friendship through all this. She saw past the media story to the man underneath, broken and grieving, and just trying to do the right thing. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "With the reward money, if you get it." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. Part of me wants to refuse it. Walk away from all of this. But Emily died because we couldn't afford the experimental treatment. Insurance wouldn't cover it. We tried fundraising, spent everything we had. It wasn't enough." His voice cracked. "If I'd had money then, real money, maybe she'd still be alive." Chen reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You can't think like that. Cancer doesn't negotiate with bank accounts." "I know. But I can't help thinking about other families. Other people facing the same choices we did. If I take this money, I could set up a fund, help pay for treatments, make sure no one else has to watch someone they love die because they couldn't afford to fight." "That's a beautiful idea," Chen said softly. "Or I could give it all to the families of those victims, the people in the photographs. They deserve something. Their loved ones died because of that operation." "You could do both. 800,000 split across multiple causes would still help a lot of people." Marcus nodded, but he still felt the weight of it. Money was never just money. It was responsibility, choice, the power to help or harm. And he'd seen firsthand what it did to people. The corruption in those ledgers had started small. A few thousand here, a favor there. Then it snowballed until entire lives were consumed by greed. He didn't want to become that. Didn't want the money to poison him the way it had poisoned the men who'd hidden it. The legal battles dragged on for weeks. The government's case was strong. The money was clearly proceeds from criminal activity. But the Cordova family lawyers were well-funded and aggressive. They argued that the statute of limitations had expired on many charges, that civil forfeiture was unconstitutional, that Marcus had no right to claim a reward for money that rightfully belonged to their clients. The media ate it up. Every hearing became a spectacle. Cameras lined the courthouse steps. Reporters shouted questions. Marcus stopped watching the news. It was too surreal, seeing his life dissected by strangers who didn't know him, who reduced his survival story to sound bites and speculation. Through it all, he kept thinking about the chamber, about those long nights sitting among crates of money, starving, wrestling with temptation. He'd been tested in that darkness, and he'd passed, or thought he had. But now, in the bright light of public scrutiny, he wondered if he'd made the right choice. Would Emily be proud of him, or would she think he was being stubborn, throwing away a chance at security because of some outdated sense of honor? He'd never know, and that uncertainty gnawed at him like hunger once had. By week 8, Marcus was exhausted by the legal system, exhausted by the media, exhausted by people wanting pieces of him, his story, his credibility. He wanted to go back to his cabin, but there was no cabin to return to. The FBI had dismantled what remained, processing it as a crime scene. His home of 5 years was gone. He thought about leaving Colorado entirely, starting over somewhere no one knew his name or his face. But where would he go? The mountains were the only place he'd ever belonged. Agent Chen found him one morning sitting alone in the safe house, staring out at the Denver skyline. She didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him in silence. Finally, she spoke. "The preliminary hearings are done. The judge is ruling in the government's favor on the forfeiture. The money stays with justice. But she's also recommending you receive the full 25% reward. Final amount is still being calculated, but it looks like you'll get just over 800,000. Marcus nodded slowly. "When?" "Could be 6 months, could be a year. These things take time. And after that?" "After that, you're free. The investigation will continue, but you've given us everything we need. You can go wherever you want, do whatever you want." "I don't know what I want anymore," Marcus admitted. Chen smiled sadly. "Then you've got time to figure it out." But time was another burden, another weight, because with time came expectation. People were watching now, waiting to see what the mountain man would do with his reward. Would he prove them right or wrong? Would he justify their faith or confirm their cynicism? Marcus thought about Emily again, about the promise he'd made at her grave 5 years ago. He'd promised to keep going, to not give up, even when giving up seemed easier. He'd kept that promise through survival, through the winter, through the discovery and the investigation. Now he needed to keep it through whatever came next. The money would come eventually. The legal battles would end. The media would move on to the next story, and Marcus would be left standing in the aftermath, holding more wealth than he'd ever imagined and more questions than answers. But he was still standing. That had to count for something. After everything, he was still here, still fighting, still trying to do right by the woman he'd loved and the man he'd once been. The rest would sort itself out, or it wouldn't. Either way, he'd survived worse. He'd survived the winter. He'd survived himself. Whatever came next couldn't possibly be harder than 30 feet of snow and a fortune in the frozen darkness. At least that's what he told himself, even if he didn't quite believe it yet. The final ruling came down on a cold October morning, exactly 1 year after Marcus had first heard that wind whisper across his porch. He sat in a federal courtroom in Denver, surrounded by lawyers, journalists, and strangers who'd followed his story like it was a television show. Judge Patricia Brennan, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, read her decision with the kind of authority that came from 3 decades on the bench. In the matter of United States versus recovered assets from the Cordova criminal organization, this court finds that all monetary assets are subject to federal forfeiture as proceeds from criminal enterprise. However, this court also recognizes the extraordinary circumstances under which Mr. Marcus Hale discovered and reported these assets. His actions, taken while facing life-threatening conditions and at significant personal cost, represent the highest standard of civic duty. She paused, looking directly at Marcus. Therefore, pursuant to federal whistleblower statutes, this court awards Mr. Hale 25% of the recovered monetary assets, totaling $814,600, plus interest accrued during the investigation period. Additionally, Mr. Hale is granted immunity from any civil claims related to his time spent on the property before reporting his discovery. The gavel came down. The courtroom erupted. Reporters rushed for the doors. Lawyers from the Cordova family shouted objections that would go nowhere. And Marcus just sat there, hands folded in his lap, feeling nothing but exhaustion. $814,000. The number meant something, he supposed, but it felt abstract, distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. Agent Chen found him in the hallway afterward. "How are you feeling?" Marcus managed a weak smile, like I just survived a second winter. "In some ways, you did." She handed him a card. "This is the contact for the financial advisor the Bureau recommends. She's good, discreet. She'll help you navigate what comes next." "What does come next?" Marcus asked. Chen studied him for a moment. "That's the question, isn't it? You've got money now, freedom. You can do anything, go anywhere. The world's open to you in a way it wasn't a year ago." "I don't want the world," Marcus said quietly. "I just want peace." "Then I hope you find it." She walked away, leaving Marcus alone in the courthouse corridor. Through the tall windows, he could see the Rocky Mountains rising to the west, their peaks already white with the first snows of autumn. The same mountains that had nearly killed him. The same mountains he couldn't imagine leaving. That night, in a hotel room paid for by the FBI's Witness Protection Program, Marcus sat with Emily's journal open on his lap. He'd been carrying it everywhere for the past year, but he'd only written in it a handful of times. The words always felt inadequate. How do you capture something as vast as grief or survival or moral weight in sentences that fit on a page? But tonight, he picked up his pen and started writing. Not for anyone else, just for himself. For the man he'd been, the man he'd become, and the man he still might be. I got the money today. Almost $1 million. You'd laugh if you could see me. I'm sitting here in a hotel room eating takeout Chinese food, and I'm technically rich. But I don't feel rich. I feel lost, because money was never what we needed. What we needed was time, more time. And that's the one thing all the money in the world can't buy. I keep thinking about our last conversation in the hospital. You made me promise to keep living. Not just surviving, but actually living. Building something, finding purpose again. I promised I would, even though I didn't believe it was possible. And now I have the means to keep that promise. But I don't know how. I don't know what you'd want me to do with this. I don't know what I want to do with it. Tomorrow, I'm meeting with the financial advisor. She's going to talk about investments and portfolios and tax strategies. And I'm going to sit there and nod and pretend any of it matters. But what really matters is this. I survived. Against impossible odds, I made it through. And I did it the right way. I didn't steal. I didn't compromise. I reported what I found and let the law handle it. You'd be proud of that, right? I hope so. Because your pride is the only currency I've ever cared about. I love you. I miss you. And I'm trying, Em. I'm really trying to figure out how to live again. Your Marcus. He closed the journal and set it on the nightstand beside the wedding ring he still wore on a chain around his neck. Sleep came slowly, but when it finally arrived, he dreamed not of the buried cabin or the frozen darkness, but of sunlight through aspen trees and Emily's laugh echoing across a mountain meadow. The financial advisor's name was Grace Nguyen. She was Vietnamese-American, maybe 50, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Marcus of the senior rangers he'd worked under. They met in her office in downtown Denver, surrounded by certificates and awards that suggested she knew what she was doing. "Mr. Hale," she began, "congratulations on your settlement. Before we discuss investment strategies, I need to understand your goals. What do you want this money to do for you?" Marcus had thought about this question for weeks. "I don't want it for myself. I mean, I need to live, obviously, but the bulk of it, I want to do something meaningful, something that would have mattered to my wife." Grace nodded, pulling out a legal pad. "Tell me about your wife." And so Marcus did. He told her about Emily, about the cancer, about watching her fight and lose, about the experimental treatment they couldn't afford, the fundraising that fell short, the helplessness of having no options left. Grace listened without interrupting, making notes occasionally, her expression neutral but attentive. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What if we set up 2 separate funds? One focused on cancer treatment assistance for families who can't afford care. The other focused on wilderness education and survival skills for at-risk youth. Both causes honoring different parts of your life with Emily." Marcus felt something shift in his chest. That could work. Over the next 3 hours, they built a plan. The Emily Hale Memorial Fund would provide grants for experimental cancer treatments not covered by insurance. It would start with $300,000 and be structured to grow over time through careful investment. The fund would help 10 to 15 families per year, giving them the fighting chance Marcus and Emily never had. The second fund, which Marcus decided to call the High Country Foundation, would create a wilderness education center in Silverton. It would teach survival skills, environmental stewardship, and outdoor leadership to teenagers from underserved communities. Kids who'd never seen mountains, never slept under stars, never learned that they were capable of more than their circumstances suggested. The center would cost roughly $200,000 to establish, including land purchase, building construction, and initial operating costs. Another $100,000 would go into an endowment to sustain it. That left Marcus with about $200,000 for himself, enough to live modestly for years, maybe buy a small piece of land and rebuild. "This is a good plan," Grace said when they'd finished. "It's thoughtful, sustainable, and it honors what you've been through." Marcus nodded. For the first time since finding the money, he felt like he could breathe. This wasn't about getting rich. It was about turning something dark into something that helped people, about transforming the criminal legacy of the Cordova organization into a force for good, about proving that even money stained with blood could be cleaned if you tried hard enough. The news of Marcus's decision broke 2 weeks later. He held a press conference in Silverton, standing in front of the old hardware store on Main Street. The town had turned out, curious and cautious. National media was there too, cameras and microphones creating a wall between Marcus and the mountains he loved. He read from a prepared statement, his hands shaking slightly. "I'm announcing today the creation of 2 charitable foundations funded by the whistleblower reward I received. The Emily Hale Memorial Fund will provide financial assistance for cancer patients seeking experimental treatments. The High Country Foundation will establish a wilderness education center here in Silverton, teaching survival skills and environmental stewardship to young people who might not otherwise have access to these experiences." He paused, looking up from the paper. "A year ago, I was trapped under 30 feet of snow, starving, facing a choice about what to do with money I'd found. I could have kept it, could have convinced myself I deserved it after what I'd been through. But I knew that money was born from suffering, from crimes that destroyed lives and families. and I knew my wife Emily would never forgive me if I profited from that kind of pain. His voice cracked, but he pushed through. So I reported it. Let the law decide what should happen. And now, with the reward I've been given, I want to create something that fights against the darkness that money came from. Cancer took my wife when we couldn't afford to fight it properly. I can't save her. But maybe I can save someone else's wife, someone else's husband, someone else's child. And maybe I can teach young people that survival isn't just about getting through hard times. It's about becoming someone you're proud to be when the hard times end. The questions came fast and loud. How much exactly was he keeping? Why Silverton? What made him think he could run a non-profit? Did he feel guilty about the reward? Was he really as noble as he claimed, or was this just good PR? Marcus answered what he could, deflected what he couldn't. But mostly he just stood there and took it, the scrutiny and skepticism, because this was the price of trying to do something right in a world that had become cynical about such things. The town's reaction was mixed. Some people thought Marcus was a hero, giving away most of his fortune to help others. The local paper ran an editorial praising his extraordinary generosity and moral clarity. The mayor called him personally to thank him for investing in Silverton's future, but others were less impressed. At the Silver Spur bar, old-timers grumbled that he was just trying to buy good publicity, that he'd probably screw up the non-profits and waste all the money, that he should have kept it quiet and used the cash to get out of their struggling town instead of pretending to save it. Rich man playing poor man's savior, one miner said into his beer. We've seen this before. Never ends well. Marcus heard the criticism, felt it like splinters under his skin. But he also heard the other voices, the mother of 3 who approached him at the grocery store, tears in her eyes, thanking him because her sister was fighting breast cancer and might qualify for the fund. The high school principal who said the wilderness program could change lives for kids who'd given up on their own futures. The cancer survivor who just hugged him in the post office, too emotional to speak. Those voices mattered more. The work began immediately. Grace helped Marcus establish the legal structures for both foundations, navigating the complex world of non-profit law and IRS regulations. They hired an oncology social worker to manage grant applications for the Emily Hale Memorial Fund. They brought in an experienced wilderness educator named Tom Brightfeather, a member of the Ute tribe, to design the curriculum for the High Country Foundation. Finding land for the education center proved challenging. Silverton was small, property scarce. Everything was either too expensive, too developed, or too remote. Marcus spent weeks driving around the area, looking at parcels that never quite felt right. Then Agent Chen called. I heard you're looking for property. Have you considered buying back your old cabin site? Marcus hadn't. The thought of returning to that place, to the spot where he'd nearly died and discovered a fortune, felt impossible. I don't think I could live there again. You wouldn't have to live there, but think about it. That site is already remote, already set up for wilderness survival. And there's symbolic weight to it. The place where you survived becomes a place where you teach others how to survive. That's powerful, Marcus. She was right. He knew it immediately. The cabin site, or what remained of it, sat on a mining claim he technically still owned. The FBI had released it back to him after finishing their investigation. He'd been avoiding even thinking about it, but now he saw it differently. Not as the tomb it had been, but as the foundation for something new. He drove up the old trail in early December, exactly 14 months after the storm that had buried him. The snow was light this year, barely covering the ground. The cabin ruins were still there, collapsed timbers and broken stone, a monument to survival and stubbornness. But the land around it was beautiful. Meadows and pine forests, creeks and rock formations, perfect for teaching wilderness skills. Marcus stood where his porch had been and felt Emily's presence stronger than he had in years. She'd loved this place, had visited him here twice, marveling at the solitude and beauty. She'd made him promise to show her more of the backcountry, to take her deeper into the wilderness. Cancer had stolen that future, but maybe he could honor it anyway. Maybe this land could become the classroom where other people learned what Emily had known instinctively. That the wilderness wasn't something to fear, but something to respect, to learn from, to be transformed by. "Okay," he whispered to the wind. "We'll build it here." Construction started in the spring. Not on the old cabin site itself, that would remain untouched, preserved as a memorial. But in the meadow beyond, they built a lodge. Simple, functional, designed to house 20 students and 4 instructors. Solar panels for power, a well for water, composting toilets, and a grey water system. Everything built to demonstrate sustainable living in a remote environment. They left the collapsed cabin visible from the lodge's main windows. Tom Brightfeather suggested placing interpretive signs explaining what had happened there, turning it into a teaching moment about survival, decision-making, and integrity under pressure. Marcus resisted at first. He didn't want his story to be the focus, but Tom pushed back gently. "Your story is why this place exists. Students need to know that. They need to understand that survival isn't just physical, it's moral. You made choices in that cabin that define who you are. That's worth teaching." So they installed the signs, told the story simply, honestly. In this cabin, a man survived 4 months buried under snow. In that survival, he discovered something that tested his character. His choice to do the right thing created the opportunity you have today. Honor that choice by making good choices of your own. The High Country Foundation officially opened in June 2025. 20 teenagers arrived for the first session. Kids from Denver, Albuquerque, Phoenix. Kids who'd grown up in cities, who'd never been camping, who thought wilderness was something from movies. They were scared and skeptical and completely out of their element. Marcus watched them arrive, remembering his own fear, the fear of the storm, of starvation, of dying alone. These kids faced different fears, but fear was fear. And the wilderness had a way of teaching you that you were stronger than your fear if you just kept moving forward. Tom led most of the instruction. Marcus helped where he could, teaching map reading and basic survival skills. But mostly, he just watched, saw the transformation happen in real time. The quiet kid from Phoenix who learned he could start a fire with friction. The girl from Denver who'd been in foster care who summited her first peak and cried at the view. The boy from Albuquerque who'd been in a gang who told Marcus, "I never knew I could feel this free." Those moments justified everything. Every legal battle, every sleepless night, every dollar spent. This was why he'd survived. Not for himself, but for this. For the chance to help others find the strength he'd discovered in the frozen darkness. The Emily Hale Memorial Fund was quieter, but no less transformative. The first grant went to a family in Colorado Springs whose father was fighting a rare form of lymphoma. The experimental treatment cost $180,000. Insurance covered none of it. The fund covered all of it. The man went into remission 6 months later. The second grant helped a young mother in Durango with aggressive ovarian cancer. She had 2 daughters under 10. The treatment the fund paid for bought her 3 more years. She got to see her youngest start kindergarten, her oldest play her first soccer game. When she finally passed, her husband wrote Marcus a letter that made him weep. "You gave us time. That's all we wanted, just more time. Thank you for giving my girls 3 more years with their mother. Thank you for letting us make memories we'll carry forever." Marcus kept that letter in Emily's journal. Read it when doubt crept in, when he wondered if any of this mattered. Because it did matter. Every life touched. Every family helped. Every teenager who learned they were capable of more. It all mattered. The town of Silverton began to change too. The Wilderness Center brought jobs, instructors and cooks and maintenance staff. It brought tourism, families visiting kids at the center, then staying to explore the area. Local restaurants saw business pick up. The gas station stayed open later. The hardware store hired 2 new employees. It wasn't a miracle transformation. Silverton was still struggling, still losing young people to cities with better opportunities. But the center gave the town something it had been missing: hope. A sense that maybe their best days weren't behind them. That maybe, with effort and vision, small mountain towns could survive and even thrive. Marcus bought a small piece of land about 5 miles from the center, built himself a modest cabin, nothing fancy, just sturdy and warm with good windows and a porch where he could watch the sunset. He lived simply, cooked his own meals, split his own firewood, spent his days working at the center or helping with the memorial fund. He dated briefly a teacher from Durango named Rachel who loved hiking and mystery novels, but it didn't work out. She wanted more than Marcus could give, wanted him to move on fully from Emily, to start over completely. And he just couldn't. Emily was woven too deeply into who he was. Letting go would mean losing the best parts of himself. Rachel understood, or said she did. They parted as friends, and Marcus returned to his solitary life, not lonely exactly, but alone. And that was okay. He'd learned in that buried cabin that being alone wasn't the same as being lost. Sometimes solitude was where you found yourself. 2 years after the center opened, Agent Chen visited. She'd retired from the FBI and was teaching criminal justice at the University of Colorado. She brought news. "I thought you'd want to know. We closed the last of the cold cases connected to your discovery. 11 murders, all solved. 4 people charged, all convicted. The families finally have answers, finally have justice." Marcus sat on his porch, coffee cooling in his hands. Did it help them? The answers? Some yes, some no. Closure is complicated, but they deserve to know the truth. You gave them that. The money did. I just found it. Chen shook her head. The money was evidence. You made it evidence by reporting it. Don't minimize what you did, Marcus. You changed lives, saved lives. That's not nothing. After she left, Marcus walked up to the old cabin site. He still did this sometimes, stood among the ruins and remembered. The fear, the hunger, the weight of choice pressing down like 30 feet of snow. He'd been tested in ways he never imagined, and somehow, against his own doubts, he'd passed. The interpretive sign beside the rubble had weathered some. The text was still clear. Students had added their own marks over time, initials carved into the wood frame, notes written in marker thanking him for his story. One simply said, "You showed me I could be brave." Marcus touched the wood, feeling the grain beneath his fingers. Emily would have loved this, would have been so proud of what he'd built from the ashes of that terrible winter. He could almost hear her voice telling him so. "You did good, mountain man. You did real good." He smiled. Let the tears come. They weren't sad tears anymore, just grateful ones. Grateful he'd survived. Grateful he'd chosen right. Grateful that even in the darkest moments, even when every instinct screamed to save himself, he'd found the strength to think bigger than his own survival. That evening, back in his cabin, Marcus opened Emily's journal one last time. He'd filled it now, cover to cover with 2 years of reflections. He read through some of the entries, saw his own transformation on the pages. The broken man who'd gone into that winter wasn't the same man who'd emerged. The mountain had rebuilt him. And then he'd used that rebuilding to create something lasting. On the final blank page, he wrote one last entry. I kept my promise. I'm living again. Not just surviving, but actually building a life that matters. The foundation is thriving. We've helped 37 cancer patients and counting. The Wilderness Center has graduated over 200 kids. Some have come back as junior counselors. Some write me letters saying the program changed their trajectory. I think you'd be amazed by what's happening here. I know I am. I'm not the same man I was. The winter broke something in me, but it also revealed something. Strength I didn't know I had. Purpose I thought died with you. I'm grateful for that. Grateful for the test, even though I wouldn't wish it on anyone. Because it taught me that character isn't what you claim to have. It's what you prove in the moments when no one's watching, when you could get away with the wrong thing, when doing right costs you everything. I proved something in that chamber. To myself. To you, I hope. I proved I was still the man you fell in love with. The one who chose integrity over convenience, who valued truth over comfort. I miss you every day, but I'm okay now. Really okay. And I think maybe you can rest knowing that. Your love didn't die with you. It just transformed into something else. Something that helps people, saves people. That's not a bad legacy for a marriage cut too short. I love you, Em. Always, Marcus. He closed the journal and set it on the shelf beside their wedding photo. In the picture, they were young and radiant, standing in that meadow, wildflowers everywhere, her dress catching the wind. He'd cried at her approach. She'd teased him forever after. Now, looking at that photo, he didn't cry. He just smiled, remembered, and felt for the first time in years something like peace. The money was almost gone now. Most of it transformed into programs and buildings and opportunities for people who needed them. Marcus kept only what he needed to live modestly, to keep showing up at the center, to keep honoring the choice he'd made in the frozen darkness. Some people said he was foolish, that he should have kept more for himself, that nobility didn't pay the bills. And maybe they were right. Maybe in 10 years he'd regret giving so much away. Maybe he'd end up broke and forgotten, just another face in the wilderness. But he didn't think so, because he'd learned something that winter that most people never learned. Money wasn't security. Integrity was. Your character was the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, the only asset that appreciated rather than depreciated over time. He'd gone into that winter as a man running from grief. He'd emerged as someone who'd faced the ultimate test and chosen the harder right over the easier wrong. That choice had cost him everything and given him everything, and he wouldn't trade it for all the money in all the hidden chambers in all the world. Because in the end, survival wasn't about making it through. It was about what you made of yourself in the process. And Marcus Hale, the mountain man who'd been buried alive and found a fortune in the darkness, had made himself into something worth surviving for. Anyone can survive if they're willing to compromise, but it takes something deeper, something stronger to survive with your soul intact, to face impossible choices and still choose integrity, to transform suffering into service. As the sun set over the San Juan Mountains that evening, Marcus Hale sat on his porch, watching the peaks turn gold, then purple, then dark, and knew that he'd done more than survive the winter. He'd survived himself, and in doing so, he'd created a legacy that would outlast any fortune hidden in any frozen chamber. Because the truest wealth isn't what you find buried in the darkness, it's what you build in the light that comes after the end. Up next, 2 more incredible true stories of courage, integrity, and transformation. Click now to continue the journey, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that doing the right thing, even when it costs you everything, is what makes us truly human.